Good evening, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to meet together and just do a little bit of a devotional through the book of Esther. We're going to be looking at different things, and one of the big questions that pops up in the study of the book of Esther is, where is God in all of this? Because people face different dilemmas and different problems. They have troubles. Things come up. They deal with evil, whether that's how people are treating each other or just calamities that take place in the world around them. We deal with moral evil when people steal or murder or abuse one another, or we suffer corruption. We deal with natural evil when we deal with things like the pandemic that we're experiencing, or when weather causes some catastrophic event, or when there's a drought or a famine and it affects entire countries and things like that. And people will begin to wonder, why are we suffering? If God's so good and He's so loving, where is He? Why are these things taking place? And the book of Esther kind of gives us an idea that God is always there and He's always working. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 1 of the book of Esther. And as we look at chapter 1, we're going to see that God is not mentioned in chapter 1, and we're going to see that He's not mentioned by name in any of the book of Esther. But He's definitely there and setting things in motion. One thing that I want us to remember is that God is always at work. He's always present in the lives of His children. And so history is very, very important, because we can look back on historical events in the Bible. We can look back and see how God has delivered His people before. We know that God doesn't change, that if He was faithful then, He's going to be faithful now, and He'll be faithful forevermore, no matter what awaits us or what lies ahead. History is important. You guys know that. But I don't want you guys to get lost so much in the timeline that, you just struggle with that so much that you can't get the story. But I want to emphasize to you that you can get a good understanding of a biblical timeline. If you can take interest in movies and series and things like that, and how things happen in certain events, if you have ever watched movies and take Star Wars for example, the movies are released at different times and they occur at different time frames. If you can kind of keep up with the events of what happened when, etc., and all of that, then you can master a biblical timeline as well and get at least a good idea of what's going on and when it's taking place, because the things that take place in the book of Esther actually coincide with other events that take place in the Bible as well. For instance, we're going to be starting off and we're looking at the world and the time and the rule of, he's called Ahasuerus here, but King Xerxes. And so how did he come to be in control, and how was he in charge, and why are the Jewish people, why are God's chosen people under his rule at that time? Well, if you look back through history, you'll see that that's not the way that it started. You've probably heard the name King Nebuchadnezzar. Well, he was king of Babylon, he was in control of Babylon, and he took over the Jewish people. And the Jews at this time are experiencing what seems to be a lot of silence from God, and they had been under control of Babylon, and then Cyrus came in and he took over, and so they went from being under the control of Babylon to control of Cyrus, and now they're under the control of Ahasuerus. And the people of God seem to have gotten comfortable. Instead of identifying with Jerusalem and identifying with God, they're pretty comfortable just to be identified as, in and amongst the Persians, and so they've become comfortable there. But we have to remember this, all the people of God are merely just here as pilgrims passing through, and so we can't get too comfortable in the world around us. Now, I've told you all that because I wanted to lead into this. The historical events that lead up to this and what's going on, it's all important. The book of Esther builds up to this really big climactic moment where God shows up in a special way. Remember, He's not mentioned by name, but you can see the fingerprints of God in every part of the book of Esther, and it's absolutely fascinating. So let's look and see what happens in the days of Ahasuerus. Let's begin the reading in chapter 1, verse 1. It says this: Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court or the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains, violet hangings, fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king, and drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the place that belonged to King Ahasuerus. Immediately here, we see we've been introduced to our first character in the book of Esther. If you read through the book of Esther, and I hope you've already started doing that, you're going to see, in some senses, it reads like a historical document that has been put together in such a way that it's really fascinating, almost entertaining. I mean, it draws you in. There's a great story that takes place here. You could even say that it's written almost in a novella type fashion. But guys, what we're seeing in this story as it develops, we're going to see lots of different characters come and go on the scene, some that stay and some that last. We've been introduced to Ahasuerus, but also to Queen Vashti. And we'll get to her in just a little bit. Her time in the story won't be very long. But King Ahasuerus here, he's kind of, he thinks of himself at least as the main guy. He's the big deal. He's the Persian ruler. He's also known as Xerxes. Xerxes is more of his name. Ahasuerus is more of his official title. In the Bible, when we're introduced to kings and things like that, they're called by their title. That's how they're supposed to be called, and so that's how they're recorded. This is a real story of things that really took place in a real place in the world at a real given time. And you can look at other documents outside of the Bible that verify his rule and his reign and some of the things he did. You may have heard of Xerxes if you have ever seen or heard of the movie 300. I'm not advocating that you go and watch that by any means, but maybe you're already familiar with it, or at least you know what I'm talking about. Xerxes is the one that ends up trying to fight against Leonidas and 300 Spartans, and he's got like 100,000 people with him, and they can't beat this small group of 300, and so he kind of embarrasses himself there. Ahasuerus embarrasses himself many different times in the story. One of the reasons he embarrasses himself is because he's trying to impress these people and keep them on his side, and he's trying to honor them, and he's got all these different advisors. But let me tell you, the Bible doesn't really tell us that Ahasuerus takes his commands or his advice or his instruction from the Lord, and so he makes mistakes, things that he regrets he does, and we'll see a little bit more about that. He makes this huge banquet, and he does all these amazing things, and not only does he make a banquet, but we're introduced to all the lavish lifestyle that he has. It begins to give descriptions of all these things that today we may not find those things important and stuff like that. But just imagine this. When young ladies want to have a big and beautiful and especially extravagant wedding, they want everything to be exactly a certain way, and so it can be just the way they imagine and be perfect and wonderful and all those things. This banquet would overshadow every royal wedding you've ever even seen on television. I mean, he's trying to go all out and show everyone the splendor and the majesty, and it's all about Ahasuerus and how special he is. He's the greatest, king that ever lived, etc., that kind of sort of thing. That's what he's wanting to show everybody, and of course he's leading up to, he's probably going to go conquer some more area and things like that, so he wants everybody to see how great it is to follow him and follow him into battle and things of that nature. But we also see that his Queen Vashti, is allowed to have banquets and feasts and things like that, at her own will and things like that. And so looking at verse 10, we see that it goes on a little bit further, and it says, on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine. See, he's under the influence of advisors and of alcohol. He commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princess her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment, the men next to him being Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus, delivered by the eunuchs. Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before the king Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. Now I'm going to go ahead and cheat a little bit, and we're going to see in chapter 2, verse 1, it says, After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. And so immediately we see that King Ahasuerus later, when he's not angry, when he's not under the influence of, intoxicating beverages, and when he's not trying to impress all his friends and all the rulers and things like that, when he's not been publicly, embarrassed or anything like that, he kind of calms down and he begins to think about Vashti again. And so in that moment, he had kind of banished her and said, you know what, she's not going to be queen anymore. He's just listening to his advisors. That seems like a good thing. And at that moment for him to do. But here's the trouble. Any decisions that he makes have serious and lasting effects. Now, he's the king. He's Ahasuerus. He's, great Xerxes. And so any decree that he places out in that day and time in their culture can never be reversed or undone. He can never draw it back and say, hey, I changed my mind. We're going to retract that. Whatever decision he makes is there and it lasts forever, and nobody can change that rule. Now, this is not the only time in the book of Esther that he makes a decision that is not one that necessarily he's happy that he's made. You and I are not too different in that sometimes we make decisions and we think, well, I could change my mind later, but the decisions that we make, we have to be careful, and we have to be careful who we take advice from, and we have to be careful that we're thinking clearly. You are only thinking clearly when you are led by the Spirit of God and you've taken the time to pray and consult with the Lord about big decisions in your life. And so don't make big decisions and don't act out of wrath or out of anger. Instead, take the time to calm down and to live and walk in the Spirit of God. Ahasuerus is obviously not doing that, and later he regrets his decision, what he had done. And so we immediately see in the book of Esther that the stage has been set, that, if this were a TV show, if we were binging the Bible together, then you'd be right here in the pilot episode. You'd see all these wonders and all these splendorous things that took place, and you'd see that immediately we encounter the first problem. The king has been disrespected. The queen has not, as been requested of her, or commanded of her, she's not come and presented herself to show everybody how beautiful she is, etc., and entertain all the guests and everyone. And so the king's been disrespected, there's a problem, and now she has basically been stripped of her title as queen. So what's going to happen now? He realizes, I don't have a queen. And so he feels an emptiness in his life because of a decision that he's made. And so we're going to see that through the book of Esther, we're going to see how God takes care of His people and protects His people no matter what's going on. He's always faithful to His people, even when His people have not been faithful to Him. And all of these events that have taken place in chapter 1 are leading up to how God's going to make provision for His people, to protect His people, and safeguard them. This is bigger than just a story of something that takes place in the life of a Jewish girl named Esther. This story has a place in the totality of the Bible that shows how God keeps His promises, even to Abraham, all the way through Christ, even through these events, even through the life of Ahasuerus and everything that he's doing and everything that takes place there. Guys, thanks for taking the opportunity to meet with me and just to read chapter 1 and just look at a few important things there. I want to encourage you, get your Bible out, go and read the book of Daniel. The youth group are going through it with Brother Tim. Daniel and Esther, they work hand in hand. They fit together, and there are other books of the Bible that fit together as well. You'll get a better understanding, a deeper understanding. We need to know these stories from the Bible because we too are going to face times where we're wondering, where is God when my life or the people that I love are in danger or in turmoil? Where's God and what is He orchestrating? God is putting together some things here in this book of the Bible that show us how He protects and guides His people. Be encouraged today. God loves you, and He's able to even work through evil rulers in order to accomplish His purposes. We want God to be glorified with our lives. Let's place our lives in His hand and just hang on for the ride. God bless you. We love you. We'll talk to you again on Tuesday.